All right, we need to get back to Apple. You know, just because Apple is up at this very moment by, I don't know, about 3-4% right now, you really should not forget what happened yesterday. Shares of the iPhone maker suffered their biggest single-day loss in 6 years. $450 billion in market value swiped away. 10% loss right now, gaining back about 3.75% of that 10%. But other tech giants looked at that, saw it, and said, oh, you know, we're on pins and needles here. They are wondering at this hour who's next to follow in Apple's stumbling footsteps. The big question coincides with CES 2019 team countdown. And yes, I changed my clothes. I know it looks like I'm wearing the same outfit from a year ago. I don't wear the same thing every single day, but we're gearing up to fly out to Las Vegas, just as we did last year there, for the world's largest consumer tech show that draws hundreds of vendors ready to push their wares and spot tech trends. I've got your credential. I'll be there to give you the all-access pass to tech leaders running Samsung, LG, Lenovo, GoPro, Sony, Harman International, you name it. We're there front and center covering all the action and how they perceive the China trade war and, of course, privacy issues, all that. I'm live Tuesday, January 8th. But one name noticeably absent from that list every single year is Apple. Apple shuns CES and prefers to do its own Apple shows. Well, our next guest says Apple stock is walking the tightrope and is calling the stock. Well, let's let him tell you. D.A. Davidson Managing Director and Senior Analyst Tom Forte is here. We're also joined by Barron's senior tech writer, Jon Swartz, who says, don't count Apple out just yet. All right. I want to begin with you, Tom. What's your call on the stock at the moment?
Sure. So first off, thanks for having me on, and I hope to see you at CES next week.
Yeah, find us. We're there.
If you look at Apple, historically, when it's trading at north of a 10% free cash flow yield, which is where it is today, it's kind of a hold your nose and buy type moment. That said, there's two real big challenges for the company on a near-term basis, which is why we said they're walking a tightrope. Number one is basically getting iPhone sales up and running again, though we do believe that they have a lot of levers they can pull in that regard. And number two, and the more fluid and more challenging, is this prolonged and often escalating trade war between the U.S. and China. And with 20% of their sales going to Chinese consumers, this continues to pose what we think is the number one risk for shares going forward.
Well, they are also trying to expand and go out into that services area. So they're trying not to be Saudi Arabia, oil-centric, iPhone-centric, and broadening their scope here. But, John, you say don't count Apple out. Why?
Well, you know, I've covered them so long. I've heard them declared dead so many times over the years. I remember back in 1996, before Steve Jobs came back, remember Apple was rumored to be sold to Sun or about to be sold to Sun, only for Apple to buy Next and bring back Steve Jobs. Now, granted, it took a couple of years for them to get their feet back underneath them, but they did come back. So I wouldn't do that. Also, thinking about the amount of cash that they're sitting on, I mean, they're loath to make these big acquisitions, but I think maybe now's the time to do something bold and try to diversify beyond the iPhone, which seems to have they've fallen into that trap of becoming an iPhone company versus a computer company.
1998, I think the stock was around $17. I mean, it's quite unbelievable, you know, where it's been and where it's going. But as we see it right now at about $147, the annual high was $233. So you'd still be buying it at a discount. That said, Tom, I really need to push you on this. It looks like Apple is trying to simply say that China's slowing economy is hurting their sales. What about the fact that Xiaomi and Huawei, two Chinese companies, are very much in the game? They make very solid phones that people like to buy, and they are less expensive. Is Apple kind of ignoring the fact or trying to say, don't look over here, don't mind the man behind the curtain, and the man behind the curtain is a phone that's less expensive and does the same thing?
Sure. So I do think even if we were talking about Apple in its heyday or recently when things were going incredibly well, that there's a hole in their product portfolio to the extent that they don't have a low-priced device to really fully exploit emerging markets, not just China, but Brazil, Russia, India, and Turkey. So, but that's a hole they may never plug. They may feel like the brand risk for offering a low-priced device is too significant. I would argue the closest they came to that was with the 5C going back in time, which was intended to be a lower-priced device, and that really didn't do very well.
John, as we head out to Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas next week, there are other tech companies whose entire assembly line at some point manages to touch somewhere in China, whether it's materials or labor. What is the China story to be brought up with these guys at CES? Because we're there and we're talking to both Chinese and American companies.
Right. That's the dark cloud hanging over that show is China. You know, Apple, in a sense, I agree with Tom. They kind of used China as an excuse when on November 1st, during their earnings call, they mentioned softening sales in India, Russia, Turkey, Brazil, as he mentioned for iPhone. But getting back to CES, it's going to hang over everyone, especially companies that are manufacturing there or dependent on them as supply partners. This actually gives a great opportunity for companies like Salesforce, which will not be at CES, but the SaaS companies are less vulnerable to trade wars and to what's happening in China. So in a sense, investors are probably going to look closer at them, like a ServiceNow, versus the companies like, I'm thinking Qualcomm, Intel, Apple, which are pretty dependent on China.
Well, listen, are you going, John? Because I know Tom
I'll
and I
see you there.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll suffer with you. Yeah.
Listen, we're a moving target. It's 3 football fields long, multiple buildings. We're all over the place, but Fox Business has the all-access pass. Great to see both of you. I'll see you next week in Nevada.